Thank you, Charity. It's great to hear that update and see all those pictures and video and all of that. It's great. I'd encourage you to talk to her after the service. We will release the children now. So let's just allow that to happen. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Psalm 126. And as you're doing that, I want to just, before we get into that passage, which is the next psalm in our series, the Psalms of Ascent, I want to just give you just a brief update on our church's transition. We are moving through this journey of transition for this time, this season, and so just want to share just a brief synopsis of kind of where we are at the current moment. And on our website, there is a blog called the Transition Blog, and there is a post from about a week and a half ago, I think, that is the report and the recommendation from our evaluation process. Alongside with that, there are some additional comments to that, and so that's available there. Many people have seen that and read it, and so that's great. So then in order to interact with that and to respond to that, we hosted an open house, kind of town hall type meeting here this past Wednesday. And there were about 95 people here in the room from all 4 different SCC locations. And it was just a good kind of family meeting. Those of us that gathered together just had a chance to talk about that report, that recommendation as to the future of our church, and ask questions and provide comments and feedback and all that kind of stuff. And so it was a great time. We spent about 2 hours here doing that. And just though, in case you're not up to speed on what that recommendation is, the recommendation coming out of our evaluation process is essentially for the multi-site strategy that SCC has been employing for a number of years as a church multiplication strategy, kind of a church planting strategy. That the recommendation is that we move away from that and that we plant each campus of SCC as a local autonomous church with its own local leadership in place. And so what that means for Sicamous and Sorrento for sure is that if we take this direction, that those 2 congregations would then move into a process, and again, it would take time. It's not an overnight thing. It would take time for those churches to then take the steps necessary to get leadership in place and get all that's needed in place to function as a local autonomous church. Chase, of course, is our newest and smallest campus, and so that's needs continued evaluation and monitoring to see at what point it may or may not be ready for that. But that is the direction that is being proposed at this time. Now, if you are a member of the church, if you're a member of SCC, there is a business meeting coming up next month, November 15th, I believe. It's a Wednesday night. And at that meeting, we will vote on a few different motions that would set things in motion towards this direction. Some draft versions of those motions were also talked about at the meeting last week, and received some good feedback on that, and we're working on refining and distilling those down. And so that's kind of where we're at the moment. So again, members, be prepared for that meeting in a month. We will publish what those motions are in advance of the meeting so that you can come prepared for that. So it's an interesting season. It's a big, important season in the life of our church. I would encourage you to continue to pray for the church, pray for the leadership, pray for your board. The board of the church is just really engaged and doing a great job these days, and so we're encouraged by that and ask you to continue to pray for them. So anyways, let's turn in our Bibles. It feels a little odd to segue like that. It's just like, here's this gigantic thing for our church. Now let's just move on. But we will in Psalm 126. Psalm 126, which is, of course, a song of ascents, and it's entitled, "Restore Our Fortunes, O Lord." And it says, "When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, 'The Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negeb. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." The word of the Lord. I've often heard this phrase, and I've often used it myself, this idea, this concept of being in the moment. You know, we talk about being in the moment, which means really being present emotionally with those around us. Being not just physically present with the people around us, but being mentally present as well. You know, because I think it's possible, and I don't know, maybe you can relate to this, but you can be there physically, but your mind can be elsewhere, right? And I think this is a good concept. I think being present in the moment is an important thing to do. I think we need to be in the moment, as it were. But if you think about that concept from a slightly different angle, think of it in terms of Christian journey, okay? As we work our way through this journey of life, of the Christian faith, we are called, in fact, by Jesus to be in the moment. You know, he said things like, "Don't worry about tomorrow. Today has enough worry of its own," and all this kind of stuff. That's true. But I think if we get so zoomed in on the moment, you know, and I think of our church's transition, you know, and we can get locked in on things that are going on, details, on particular strategies or whatever, just different things. We can get so zoomed in on the moment. Or think about your own life. You get zoomed in on what's going on right now, that the downside of that, the danger of that, is that it's really easy in doing that to kind of turn our backs on our context, to ignore the past. I think context is actually really important. You know, I think we do have to reflect on and remember what has gotten us to this point. What are the things that have occurred that led to this present moment? I think we need to bear that in mind and to consider it. And if we get so zoomed in on being in the moment, we can also lose this sense of hopeful longing for the future, you know, because as Christians, we do look ahead. We do look forward. We must be hopeful for the future. There must be in us a sense of longing for what God is going to continue to do and where this all leads in the end. And I think this applies when it comes to joy. I think that in this psalm we see this idea that our present joy as the people of God, as individuals and as his people collectively, our sense of present joy is built on a platform, on a foundation of what God has done and our past joy in that. And our present joy also looks toward a future joy. And if you were here a couple weeks ago and were paying attention, you might have noticed that I'm using the same kind of past, present, future paradigm as that Psalm 124. But I think it comes through very clearly in this psalm again. It's also how I think of our church's transition. You know, we looked back and celebrate and grieve the past. We look around and evaluate, and now we're moving towards a new future for our church. I think it's a good way of thinking about life and the world. And so we look back into the past, and we see there in verse 1, it says, "When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion." That's an interesting phrase, and perhaps if I were a prosperity gospel preacher, which I am not, if you're not aware, prosperity gospel is basically an altered version of the gospel that says that, if I do this and if I do that, if I have lots of faith, then God's going to bless my material life. He's going to bless my finances and my possessions, and He's going to do that here and now. And there's kind of this prosperity mentality around it. And so it would be easy to take that phrase, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion. But, material possessions, material wealth, that's really, that could be part of God's blessing. That could be part of the fortunes that God restores, but that's not the whole picture. Another translation of the Bible, the NASB, the New American Standard, renders this phrase as, when the Lord brought back the captive ones of Zion. There's a different way of seeing it there. It's not just about things and the fortunes, but there's a sense of release into freedom. And so we have really this idea of restoration, that God is putting back what was, that He's fixing what was broken. And so the people of God look back and they say, when the Lord restored the fortunes. This is the same phrase too that's used, by the way, in Job. At the end of the story of Job, the story of Job, Job was tested and everything was taken from him, and yet he remained faithful to God through it all. And at the very end of the story, it says there that the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. And so in this psalm, we see this same concept. When the Lord restored the fortunes, when God did something incredible and put back what was taken, fixed what was broken, we were then like those who dream. Like those who dream. I like how the Message paraphrases that. It says that it seemed like a dream, too good to be true. Have you ever experienced that in your life, when something incredible happens and you're just like, I just can't believe it. I'm just incredulous. It's amazing. Filled with awe and wonder, like a dream, too good to be true. Laughing and singing, and our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. If you know me at all, I'm not an overly outwardly expressive kind of person. I'm all for reverence. My favorite spiritual disciplines include silence and solitude, for example, which means I like to be quiet and I like to be alone. But when you think about this idea of Christian journey, and when it comes to a moment in that journey to celebrate, well, yeah, then we should. We should. The good news of the gospel ought to inspire in us as Christians expressions of gladness. We should say it out loud. We should sing as we've sung this morning. We should laugh. We should smile. We should be filled with joy at what God has done. And that joy and the recognition of where it comes from should spill over into people outside of this family of God, the people of God. It says there that then they said among the nations, they said what? The Lord has done great things for them. The recognition of the reason for the joy of God's people is not contained to God's people. It's like people saying, well, have you heard? Have you heard what God did for those people? And the people of God saying, well, people are saying what God has done. A lot of times when I hear that expression, that statement, well, people are saying, it's usually associated with somebody who's maybe got a bit of a complaint. It's not too happy. Well, people are saying, and it's usually tied to the infamous they. They, right? Well, I can't believe what they did, and people are saying. So it's nice to have this in maybe a little more positive light there. Because here's the point, though, is that when something good happens, and when you reflect on it, you celebrate and rejoice. And so when you think about the gospel, when you think about what God has done in your life, how He saved you through His Son, Jesus Christ, yeah, you should think back on it. You should look back on it and celebrate it and rejoice. It reminds me of the church I grew up in. We had Sunday night church service. I don't know if you grew up in that kind of context as well. We had Sunday school in the morning, Sunday, and then the service, and then Sunday night you had a different service altogether. And a lot of times, very often, in our church, the pastor would open it up for testimony time. And he would say, does anybody want to share what God has done in their life? And so people would stand up. It was kind of like open mic kind of thing. Our church was small enough, though, that you could just stand up and say, well, this is what God did in my life. And sometimes it was as recent as some specific event that week or whatever. But a lot of times it was people just testifying to God's salvation in their life. It was people just standing up and saying, I was going down a bad road in my life at one time, and God came along. He rescued me through his son, Jesus Christ. And so we ought to do that. As the people of God, we ought to share with one another. We ought to tell one another what God has done and how he's restored us. Now, this begs the question, of course, when you think about what it says there in verse 1, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion. Well, what was restored? What great things has God done for his people? This psalm is perhaps tied to the time of Ezra and the return of captives, the return of exiles from Babylonian captivity. And so that would make sense, that people are remembering that collectively, thinking about their history as the people who were returned from exile, when the Lord brought back the captive ones, as it were. And so that makes sense, but really the whole of Scripture, the whole of the storyline of the Old Testament is the story of God restoring and doing great things for his people over and over again, intervening in his people's lives. Think of the Exodus, the great Exodus out of Egypt. If you read that story, that's a very dramatic story about how God intervened and brought his people out of slavery into the promised land. And of course, the ultimate great thing that he's done, and what this all points toward, what this is all sort of pointing to and precursor of and a type of, is the great thing that God has done in sending Jesus to die on the cross to make a way for our salvation. That's the greatest thing he's ever done. That is how he works his work of restoration in our lives, in the church, and in the world. And so when you think of all this, thinking about reflecting on the past, contextualizing it, celebrating it, what the point for our lives is, how this applies to us, is that your past actually matters. Your story has meaning. Everything that's happened to you up to this point, what got you to this present moment, matters. It all meant something. Every trial and every tribulation, every heartbreak and every disappointment, every loss and every hurt, all of these things have been a part of your journey. All of these things have formed the content of the chapters of your life. It all means something. But here's the thing. Those things are not the entirety of your story, nor are they your identity. You, if you are in Christ, you have a new identity in Christ. You're taking off the old and you're putting on the new. And as the Lord wills, today is not the end of that story. Remember, the context of this celebration that we see here in Psalm 126 is restoration. It's a celebration of restoration, which means that something had been taken, something had been broken. And so in our lives are broken. Something's been taken from us. And it is from the sin and shame of your past that God has and is delivering you through the power of the blood of Jesus Christ, which then brings us into this present moment. We see this in verse 3 that says, the Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. And so whatever it was that the first couple of verses is in reference to, whatever it is in your own life that you think about your past and where you've come from and all that's happened, all that's led up to this moment, whatever it was, we as the people of God, as the people of God do here in Psalm 126, recognize God's great work of deliverance and restoration, and now can be presently filled with joy. Look at this, the three words there at the end of verse 3. It says, we are glad. You notice that's in present tense? Did you notice that everything before that is in past tense? when the Lord restored, when God did this, we were like people who were living in a dream. We laughed and we sang. And now it says, we are glad. Now, there are some translations of the Bible that put that in past tense. We see that in the Revised Standard, also in the Christian Standard Bible. But nevertheless, the implication is the same, is that this gladness is meant for the present. Even if rejoicing had been done in the past, that does not mean that it's not going to continue being done in the present. After all, when you think about the purpose of these psalms, and this one in particular, as a psalm of ascent, these are songs that the people of God sung together with one another and to one another as they made their way up to Jerusalem for worship. So think of that present moment as they recount and revel in God's deliverance along the journey towards worship. We were glad, and we are glad here and now. This statement of the second part of verse 3, we are glad, is really the hinge point of this psalm. As I said, everything before it is past tense, everything after it is future. Eugene Peterson puts it this way. He says that present gladness has past and future. And this really is the upside of being in the present moment. Earlier I said that, we can be in the present moment, but that can have a downside. We can get so locked into just what's happening right now, the current issue, the current problem, the current thing, that we ignore the context and we forget about the future. But when we build our joy now on the past joy and God's work in the past and looking towards the future, then we have true joy in this moment as we make our way along. Yet we live in this tension, don't we? We live in this tension. We know that, yes, God has delivered. God has provided his salvation through Jesus on the cross. Yes, he's restored. Jesus said it's finished. All of that. But we still live in a broken world, don't we? We just look around. We experience that all the time. And so we live in this tension between now and not yet. God has delivered, yes, and he will continue to deliver. I'm reading right now this book, Robinson Crusoe. Anybody read that? It's an old book. It's actually kind of hard to read. I kind of don't enjoy it. But I kind of want to read some of these old classics. If you don't know the story of Robinson Crusoe, you could read, or not read, but watch the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, which is about 20 years old, I think now, Castaway. But it's kind of based on this story, Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is basically, he's a castaway on this island by himself. And he's there for a very long time. And he discovers that there's a local tribe of indigenous people who come from another island after a battle, after a war, and they bring their captives with them to his island. Now, they don't know that he's there, but they bring them, and they're cannibals, and so they eat their prisoners of war. And Robinson Crusoe sees this and discovers this going on, and he's horrified by it. And there comes a time when he is actually able to rescue one of the captives. And so now he has this indigenous person. He refers to them as savages, but he takes this person in, and he rescues him on a Friday, and so he calls him Friday. That's what he names this man. And through the course of time, he begins to educate him on the Christian faith, and he teaches him about God and about the devil. And there's a particular dialogue in there where they're talking about these things, and Friday, is thinking about it deeply, and he basically says, well, okay, if there's God, the one true God, the big God who's over all, above all, in charge of everything, and yet there's this devil, and you say that God's going to defeat the devil, God has defeated, and God is going to defeat the devil. Why doesn't he just do it now? And I say to that, yeah, Friday, that's a great question. And Robinson says basically the same thing. He's like, yeah, that's great. I need to study the scriptures some more and think about this. And we can all relate to that, I think. We can all relate to Friday's sense of that tension. Like, what why doesn't God just deal with this now? What's going on? Well, to understand that, of course, we'd have to get into the mind of God, which I think would be quite difficult, to be honest. But the point is that we live in this tension. This moment that we live in really matters. Your present really matters. How you live now really matters. Your perspective on things matters now. How you live now echoes for eternity. So yes, we need to be in the present moment. Yes, we need to live now, but we need to do it built on the context of our past, looking ahead towards the future. And so with that in mind, let me just ask you this question. How's your gladness level right now? The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. Are you glad? I know we can't always feel that gladness, can we? I mean, we go through hard times, things happen, and our experience and our feelings are real, and we don't always have that gladness. But I hope that when you come back to it, when you gain perspective, that you can say, yes, the Lord has done great things for us. We are indeed glad. And we can be glad because we have a future. Because we have a future. Verse 4 now moves into that future tense, and it says, restore our fortunes, O Lord. This is really an echo of verse 1. Verse 1 is a celebration of what God's great restoration. It says in verse 1, when the Lord restored the fortunes. Now here in verse 4, it's calling again. God, do it again. Continue to do it. Lord, restore our fortunes. It is a hopeful and expectant cry for future deliverance. And then the psalmist provides sort of two analogies. Restore our fortunes, first of all, like what? Like streams in the Negeb. Negeb is a desert. I'll explain that in a minute. We see very similar language to this in places like Isaiah 43:19 that says, behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and what? And rivers in the desert. And that is a direct reference to the Messiah. That's a messianic prophecy right there in Isaiah 43. It points towards Jesus the Messiah, who is compared to these rivers in the desert. But the Negeb is basically it's a large desert area in the south of Israel. The word itself means dry or parched. I'm a big fan of calling things what they are, and so that's probably what they did. They said, well, where is that? Well, it's the dry place. Okay, well, let's call it dry. Okay, cool. That makes sense. It's a place where there aren't really any streams. It's a place that is, in fact, dry. There isn't rivers in that area. There isn't a whole lot of water. But when the rain comes, the streams are restored. All the little pathways, all the little gullies fill up with water, and the ground can then spring into life. And so this verse 4 is really a cry for God's future work. Restore our fortunes like, and it uses this imagery of streams in the desert, which would be familiar to the people. Restore our fortunes like when the rain comes and fills up the desert and the ground is wet and life springs up. Restore our fortunes like that, God. And then the second analogy is a little more agricultural. Comes through in verses 5 and 6. Verses 5 and 6 are really just parallels of each other. It's a great example of parallelism, and I'll show you what I mean. It's got it broken down there. The first line of verse 5 says, those who sow in tears. And then verse 6, the parallel to it is, he who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing. Do you see how those two things say basically the same thing, just in different words? That's an example of parallelism. Second lines of each verse is the same. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. That's verse 5. Verse 6, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Now, there is a hymn, an old hymn called Bringing in the Sheaves. I won't sing it for you. I don't believe we'll be singing it here in church. It does exist. You can look it up and listen to it. A sheave, sheaf, whatever that word is. You don't really go down to Save On Foods and buy a sheaf anymore, do you? That's not, so a sheaf is just it's like a bundle of grain stalks, like a bundle of wheat. It's this picture of abundance and plenty, that God is restoring his provision to our lives. So these two verses are saying, they're parallel to each other, and they're basically saying the same thing. That what they're saying is that there is an expectation among God's people for God's deliverance and restoration. We see a similar sentiment in Psalm 30, verse 5, that says, "Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning." There's an expectation for God's work and our joy in it. Our culture is, I find, oddly optimistic at times, perhaps unrealistically so to some degree. But there's another side to the message of our culture, which is actually quite pessimistic and teaches us to really lower our expectations. I saw this there's a movie we used to watch with our kids years ago, a movie called The Tooth Fairy. Anybody know this movie? Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, or as my kids used to call him, Rock the Dwayne Johnson. And he plays in this movie this older, kind of washed up hockey player, and he's playing kind of semi-pro. He's had his big career, now he's kind of at the tail end of it, and he's a bit jaded and cynical, and there's a scene in there where he's talking to this little 8-year-old boy, he's signing autographs, and he signs this autograph for this little boy, and the little boy says, "Yeah, I want to be just like you, and I'm going to play in the NHL one day," which he's not, because statistically it's just never going to happen. And so he's, Dwayne, the character played by The Rock, he says that. He's like, well, it's not going to happen, and he's not wrong. And basically just crushes this little boy's dream. And at the very end of it, he says, "Lower your expectations. That's how you're going to be happy." He's not wrong in some ways, when it comes to the desire of every little boy to play in the NHL. It's probably not going to happen. But as believers, as Christians, when it comes to our perspective on God, the opposite is actually true. Raise your expectations of God. That's how you're going to be happy. Anticipate God's good work. Look forward to what he's going to do. And so what this means for us today is that our future, your future, my future, the future matters. It's real, it exists, it's coming. And what you long for in that matters. What you hope for, what you expect matters. Where you're headed matters. Do you know where you're headed? Do you know what path you're on? Do you know what the destination is? I hope you do. We are reminded of this very clearly when we come to the table of the Lord's Supper. Today, here in this present moment, on October 22nd, 2023, at this time, we come in this moment and we proclaim the Lord's death, the Apostle Paul says, past, right? Until what? Until he comes. That's future. We look back to God's great work through Jesus on the cross, and we look ahead to eternal joy in his presence. In the meantime, of course, we struggle along the way, and we do so hopefully and joyfully. And this meal is meant as a reminder of that. This meal is meant as an encouragement. This meal is meant, even though it's physically, this is tiny, this is meant as spiritual sustenance for us along the journey. I was reminded of, I used to hike with a guy back in college, and sometimes there'd be 3 or 4 of us in the group, and he was the strongest hiker in the group, and he was the most outdoorsy, and he also had a keen sense of where everybody was at in the group, and what he used to do is he'd get to the kind of this critical moment where he could sense that everyone's kind of maybe getting a little tired, a little worn out, maybe a little bored, whatever, and he would stop and he would say, "Does anybody need a morale booster?" And the first time he said that, I thought, what is he talking about? And he reached in his bag and he'd pull out these little chocolate bars, like the little ones you get at Halloween. And I was like, oh, that's what he means. Oh, I get it. Yeah, I'll take a morale booster. Now this is more than a morale booster, but I think you get my point. I think here at the critical moment, every week we come together and we participate in this meal, and doing so, observing this, gives us this sustenance that we need for the week ahead. Fills us up. This little bit of food doesn't fill us up physically, but Jesus, fills us up spiritually. And so this is why we come to the table.